She thought he was unaware. She sat in a courtroom that smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish, a small, amused curl at the corner of her mouth, convinced of victory. The gallery around her blurred into faces and cameras. The judge's gavel lay dormant like a promise. Then the playback began. A voice, intimate and sharp, filled the room. Words caught off guard, laughter threaded through calculation, a confession so casual in tone it made the air in the chamber colder than the marble. Heads turned. Sienna's smile tightened. For the first time in public, she looked afraid. Grant Whitmore listened from a distance he had cultivated all his life. Composed, 3 steps removed, a man who measured everything by consequence and timing. He did not clap, did not rise when the murmurs rose. He let the room do what rooms do when the defenses of a performance, cracking, become visible. He had known the danger of performance for years. In boardrooms, on stages, in marriages polished for the cameras. But this moment, even before it came, had been his to orchestrate. Weeks earlier, he had arrived at his estate with the ease of a man who had traveled often enough to find home both anchor and stage. The drive up the long lane had been a familiar ritual. Wrought iron gates, a sweep of gravel that chewed at his tires, hedges trimmed to a surgeon's margin. A soft rain had left oil-slick ripples on the drive. The gardens stored wet perfumes under the oaks. He expected warmth and the small domesticities that had threaded through their years. A dinner set, the television turned down for the night, a hand at the small of his back when she came to greet him. He expected the ordinary. He had not expected the hollow. The house held its own voice. Inside, lavender from a sachet on the foyer table mixed with the mineral tang of rain and the metallic gleam of the foyer's marble. Photographs lined the walls. Vacations with smiles practiced for optics. A sculpture with the couple frozen mid-conversation. A triptych taken at a charity gala where Grant's tie was crooked on purpose and Sienna's laugh was a practiced light. In those images, their marriage looked like the kind of safety most people bank on. Reputation, stability, the correct distribution of attention. Grant took in the small things first. A scarf that didn't belong to him lay over the banister. A lipstick-stained glass on the sideboard. The faint dusting of another man's scent on the pillow of a chair in the study. These details were neither proof nor accusation. They were fissures, tiny faults in a face he had trusted. He made a note of them internally, a surgeon's list under skin. Items to be catalogued, moments to be observed. He walked toward the stairs, because the voice had come from there. Not angry or sorrowful, but arched with glee. It was a private sound, the sort people reserve for conspiracies and champagne. Words floated down the stairwell like confetti. She was not cursing.
She was not pleading. She was arranging. She spoke of transfers, share divisions, of an amount that was obscene in its precision. She said things that had no love in them, only ledger entries and imagined futures. Grant felt the room, his room, tilt slightly inside his chest. It was not the shock of discovery that undid him. It was the recognition that someone had been rehearsing a life without him. He stopped where the hallway thinned, where the light from the landing made the banister a bright seam. The world contracted into the sound of her voice. For a moment he considered the dramatic exit, the confrontation that would crack her smile into pieces. He felt anger rise like a tide. Then he closed it down. Anger could be useful, but poorly timed. He moved like a man accustomed to waiting, measured steps, quiet breath, a calculation on his tongue. When she came downstairs moments later, radiant in a way that only people who think they control scenes can be, she kissed his cheek without looking like she was kissing him. She asked about his travel in the casual language of someone who believes familiarity is armor. He answered as he always had, precise, courteous, the kind of husband a public might describe as unfazed. He did not mention the scarf. He did not ask about the voice on the stair. He kept his eyes on the soft plane of her face as if it were a map he had once read and could not trust to guide him now. After dinner, when a laugh slipped from her over a text she read with the glow of the phone painting her skin, Grant excused himself. He had to be alone to turn the feeling in his chest into something useful. Alone in the study, the room seemed to hold the memory of his footsteps. He opened a drawer and pulled out a thin envelope with the initials of his law firm. The paper inside smelled faintly of lavender, a matching echo of the foyer. He laid the envelope on the desk and let the truth of it be that whatever came next would require procedure. He had not told anyone yet, not Franklin Doyle, not Cole Maddox. Secrets, he knew, proliferate in careless mouths. He kept the discovery like a small, sharp stone, heavy, finite, potentially lethal if thrown. He set to work in the only way he trusted, by gathering the architecture of the thing. Proof, when fashioned correctly, did not need to be shouted. It breathed. It would, he decided, speak in a language Sienna could not perform in front of a judge. If this moment prompts anything in you, if this kind of betrayal scratches at something you recognize, tell us in the comments how you would have reacted. He recorded the call. The act was less about immediate leverage and more about fixing the light on the crack. For Grant, owning a moment meant being able to replay it, to dissect cadence and motive like a critic of human strategy. He labeled the file with a date and a meaningless tag, the way one preserves a thing while intending to show it only when it will do the most damage.
He stored a second copy in an encrypted folder, a small paranoia he allowed himself because prudence had a habit of looking like coldness to those who misread reserve for detachment. The first person he told, finally, was Franklin Doyle. Franklin arrived at the estate the next afternoon, a man wide in the chest and narrow in distraction, a solicitor whose gestures were economy translated into leather and steel-gray hair. Franklin had been Grant's lawyer for a decade, through acquisitions and philanthropic disputes and the small legal skirmishes that wealth attracts. He understood better than most that law is a game of patience, a chessboard where capture comes only after positioning. They met in a room lined with books, where the light fell in panels and the coffee was black enough to be a confidence. Grant watched Franklin as he listened, and in the pauses that marked the older man's attention, he found a map to proceed. He did not exaggerate, he gave the facts and let them stand on their own authority. "He's traveling with her name on everything," Grant said at one point, voice even. "Not all of it legal. She's been setting up contingencies, contracts, fake accounts. I overheard her. She's been confident." Franklin set a hand on the dossier Grant had prepared. He ran his finger down a page and read into his eyes the lines of habit. Sift, weigh, decide. "Listen," Franklin said finally. "We do not make this personal. We show structure. We show pattern. We make sure—" He paused, and for the first time in the conversation a human tone crept into his cadence. Not anger, not surprise, but the register of someone who has seen the arithmetic of greed before. "We make sure that if she files, she walks into what looks like the trial of her life." That phrase, "if she files," contained the decision he had arrived at in the silence of the staircase, to let the first move be hers. There was a mechanical truth to this. People reveal themselves most fully when they think the contest is already won. A confident opening often contains the misstep of arrogance. If Sienna truly believed she had orchestrated her exit and her take, she would play her cards openly. Grant, conversely, could only benefit from watching the hand she showed. They called Cole Maddox the same day. Cole arrived in a car that smelled faintly of tobacco and gasoline, a man who looked as if sleep were a negotiable commodity. He walked into the study, glanced at the photographs on the mantel the way a man checks foundations for cracks, and then set his bag down with the purposeful energy of someone who had been trained to make evidence obey. He did not waste time with condolences. He wanted files, access, the small, boring permissions that allowed everything of consequence to be exposed. "What do you want me to look at?" Cole asked, voice flat with a practical curiosity. Grant handed him a list, names, dates, the trivial items that become significant when patterns align. Cole began with travel patterns. He traced itineraries across the world and found the same footprints. Dinners in hotels where service writes down names for tabs. Two-seat flights booked under variations of the same alias. Receipts for transfers that left in small but telling increments. He traced credit card statements and found a collection of filings and subfilings, a lattice of LLCs that served as buffer zones for transfers. They were not illegal, not in and of themselves, legitimate-seeming companies that hid the true destination of funds. In a separate column, Cole highlighted photographs. Sienna with a man in a restaurant whose hand was remembered by a watch, whose make was expensive enough to be a brand marker. Sienna in a villa in Santorini, laughing with a man whose face blurred out on the back of a camera, labeled Mosaic 1219. Each photo was a fragment. Together they suggested a rhythm, a method. Cole's report arrived over several nights in the form of emails and couriered folders. He wrote in clipped sentences that read like maps. Excerpt: Investigator notes, Cole Maddox. Patterns of engagement with multiple targets identified. Similar grooming language in messages recovered. Series of shell entities established in 2016 to 2018. Overlapping beneficial owner info obscured via nominee registrations. Travel logs show parallel bookings with men of significant net worth. Transfers from victims to intermediary accounts followed within 48 to 72 hours after private dinners. No criminal charges traced to Sienna directly. Pattern suggests methodical asset separation rather than single-act fraud. Further deep dive recommended into financial advisors and legal counsel associated with Sienna's accounts. Cole's voice in his notes was not accusatory. It was arithmetic. He showed Grant ledgers of probability and irregularities rather than the moral language a betrayed spouse might crave. That clinical distance was useful. It framed the story not as a melodrama, but as a sequence of actions someone could point to one by one. Alongside the dossiers Cole compiled, Franklin began to sketch the skeleton of a legal strategy. The key, he said, was to establish two things clearly and simply. First, the premarital structures that had been in place long before Sienna's actions, their formation and legal effect. Second, the pattern of conduct that suggested a conspiracy to extract funds under false pretenses. Franklin explained the architecture in accessible language, the way a teacher might draw a complicated concept on a blackboard and then step back to let the class see the whole of it. LLCs, trusts, prenuptial protections, Franklin murmured as he thumbed through corporate filings. They do not make you invulnerable, Grant. They make the battlefield clearer. If these were set up properly, then there is a paperwork story, a clean line between marital assets and separate assets.
If she attempts to bleed the companies, we will be ready to show the bleed is personal, not marital. He did not promise outcomes. He did not say the court would necessarily accept every argument. That was a line Franklin never crossed. Law can be argued, not coerced. What he promised instead was preparation so detailed that chance would have to posture as something it was not. In the nights that followed, Grant did what he did best. He performed the role expected of him. He answered calls with the composed brevity of a man who had built an empire on degrees of separation. He attended charity dinners in which he smiled at philanthropists and let cameras take photographs of a marriage the cameras were meant to believe. Each public appearance was a layer of camouflage they both wore for the world, and a layer of pressure for Sienna. She, for her part, acted with the sort of confidence that comes when someone believes their script cannot be interrupted. At home, the domestic theater unfolded with the odd intimacy of practiced partners. Sienna cooked sometimes, a hobby she treated with the same performative lightness as her social life. She would say things now and then, flippant comments about restarting, about freedom, as if the vocabulary of escape were a joke told aloud. Grant answered each of these with a neutral citizen's distance, the husband who listens without committing. When friends visited and spoke of future plans, Sienna laughed, the sound the same as the voice that had been caught on the landing. It was a laughter Grant could place now in the ledger of cause and effect. He catalogued her remarks with an ironic tenderness. He was not cruel. He was a man cataloguing a loss, line by line. Outside the house, the world did what the world does to wealth and scandal. Reporters gathered the edges of what they could see like scavengers counting feathers. A magazine photographer trailed Sienna to a shop where she bought an odd statuette and could not quite conceal a small rush of triumph. Another time, a columnist wrote about the whispers among venture partners. Grant learned to let such things pass. He would not let public noise be the cause of his moves. It would become their fuel instead when the time came to use attention as an instrument. During these weeks, Cole's findings expanded into a narrative that described Sienna not as a villain in cinematic costume, but as someone whose talent for arithmetic and persuasion congealed into a career of advantage-taking. Cole found patterns in the small things, a certain phrasing she used in messages, a way of introducing herself in hotel lounges that sounded rehearsed, the same photographer credited under different names. Every detail was another stitch in a cloth they planned to present to a court. Grant kept his own private ledger of sorrow. He wrote, in his head mostly, and occasionally on the margins of papers no one else would read, the story of what he had imagined their life to be. The memories were blunt instruments and gentle things both. The first time Sienna had put her head on his shoulder at a charity event, grateful for the quiet in a room full of noise. The argument over a painting that had ended with both of them laughing at themselves. The small, early habits that had convinced him she was anchored.
These recollections did not change his strategy. They fed a quiet moral accounting he could not spend away. One evening, sitting alone on the terrace that looked out over lights arranged like a constellation of expense and taste, he allowed himself a small, controlled anger. It was not aimed at the money. Money had been a thing they shared, for better or worse. It was a tool, a set of constraints and comforts. He felt grief for the loss of a future he had counted on, for the trust that had been misappropriated. But even grief in Grant's chest had order. He catalogued it and then put it away in a place where emotion could be consulted but not used as evidence. Cole's next set of documents arrived in a manila folder left on the study desk like a deliberate breadcrumb. The folder contained a grid of exchanges, dates, transaction amounts, partial names, and an index of properties purchased under the names of anonymous companies. There were photos of private dinners, not sensational but telling, hands meeting over a shared plate, eyes engaged in conversation meant to be private. Cole also included redacted excerpts from contracts where Sienna's name appeared under titles that suggested consultancy or advisory roles that were thinly defined at best. Cole's next set of documents: interview with service staff at Hotel Aurelia. She was always very composed, always stayed in one suite, made sure the rooms were quiet. Used to have the same man join her, always in a suit, very polite. Advisory contract, redacted. Terms vague, payment via intermediary account, consulting scope described as relationship facilitation and companionship management. Photographs: Santorini Villa, 1229. Yacht off Amalfi, 06-2020. Private dining in Manhattan, 03-2021. Companion lists overlap with donors and investors who later reported unexpected financial adjustments. The language Cole used, companionship management, was deliberately dry, a cordon against the melodrama such phrases invite. It did, however, do the work of phrasing a pattern in terms a court could accept as evidence. It translated human manipulation into the material of law, agreements, payments, services rendered, or the lack thereof. Meanwhile, Franklin worked on the prenuptial and corporate filings that established the legal bones of Grant's case. He showed Grant the counts where the estate defined certain companies as separate property, the paperwork that predated the marriage, and the language of irrevocability. Franklin's explanations were simple and precise. If the court recognizes what's properly separate, the equitable division clause applies to a narrower pool. If we can also show that funds were diverted for personal gain under false pretenses, that narrows it further. Show them the confession, Cole suggested after listening to the stairwell file one more time. He did not like melodrama either. He liked the silent logic of recorded evidence. It's not dramatic if it's not contextualized, but together with the financials, it becomes a story. The plan formed like a crystalline map in Grant's mind. He would not storm the house with his lawyers and expose Sienna to the humiliation that feeds tabloids. Instead, he would hold a reservoir of proof. He would let Sienna act as though she were in command. Let her file, let her headline the newspapers. People in a position of power often reveal their methods when they assume the table is won. When she filed, they would be ready with both the dry structural defenses and the pattern of conduct that made the filings appear not as coincidence but as design. There was an ethical margin to everything he considered. He did not seek vengeance. He sought a legal resolution that would nullify the maneuvers that attempted to strip him of his property and his privacy. If law could not strip away the hurt, it could at least prevent a repeat, for himself and for others who might be targeted by a pattern of calculated predation. That thought gave the whole enterprise a public dimension. The case could become more than personal retribution. It could be a ledger of deterrence. A week later, Sienna surprised him with a charity benefit where she would chair a committee. She lit the room with that practiced smile, dressed in a gown that had been chosen to be photographed, her hair the exact kind of soft wave that reads well in evening light. Grant watched her from a table as she spoke of the Foundation's goals and the need to give back, the rhetoric of empathy used like a handkerchief to distract attention from the work at stake. He wanted to stand up, to walk to the podium and reveal the ledger as one would unfold evidence in a detective novel. He restrained himself. It would be theater, he knew, and theater belonged to the naive. In the weeks that followed, Sienna's moves grew bolder. She met with a brokerage, or so her social media suggested. She spoke with a financial advisor in a way that implied she was preparing a life divorced of constraint. Rumors started to swell, leaked whispers that mutated interest into narrative. Grant's feeds filled with speculation. Journalists asked mutual acquaintances innocuous questions about the health of the marriage. Grant answered nothing. He allowed suspicion to luxuriate and do its work. Suspicion is most damaging when left to the imagination. At home, the small cruelties continued. Sienna's texts displayed a calm that now burned him more than anything else. Planning brunches without him, remarking on the freedom of single women at conferences, slipping in mentions of lawyers with a casual inflection that suggested she considered it a commodity. Once, when she left a document on the kitchen island, a draft of the divorce petition she had printed and forgotten to retrieve, Grant paused in the doorway and read a headline she had composed for herself in legal language. The numbers were obscene. 70% she demanded, 30% for herself, and the rest for charity. It was a performance in entitlement. He did not take the paper that night. He only photographed it and sent the image to Franklin. "She's moved faster than I expected," he wrote, a simple message that contained the scale of the problem now, visible. Franklin replied with the same cool confidence that had steadied Grant through hostile takeovers and regulatory audits. "Good," Franklin wrote. "Let her file. Let the record reflect the claim. We will respond. Preparation is everything." There were nights when Grant imagined confronting Sienna physically, not violent, but the kind of moral confrontation that tears someone's crafted facade. The temptation was primal, to gather the documents and confront her on the spot, to expose her in the place where the trust had been violated. He did not. He moved instead through rituals of normality. He maintained the household's rhythms. He attended dinners. He had wine with her when the scene called for it. Each act of composure was both a tribute to restraint and a strategic placement of a brick in the wall that would keep the public at the right remove. Between meetings, he read the documents Cole produced. He learned to translate the dry columns into human behavior. An invoice proliferated not out of necessity, but out of design. A contract structured with obfuscation rather than detail. Transfers that read like apologies in currency rather than words. It was not one smoking gun. It was a ledger of pattern. To expand the case's scope, Cole proposed contacting several individuals who had once sat where Grant did. Older men of means who had been seduced into fatal meetings and then discovered their accounts quietly lightened. Cole's notes were careful to anonymize. He spoke to service staff. He typed transcripts of interviews, where wardrobe notes and table positions spoke louder than direct accusations. None of these men wanted public fights. That was the point. Predation thrives on silence. The dossier thickened. Franklin began drafting preemptive motions to preserve electronic data, to compel certain releases if necessary, to maintain the integrity of records that once altered would no longer serve as testimony. Lawyers talk in contingencies. Grant had long since become accustomed to living within them. The motion drafts were not theatrical. They were cold, precise instruments whose sentences could make or break an argument in the hands of a judge. "Grace in the conduct, precision in the law," Franklin said one night, folding his hands over the table as if to steady his own voice. "That is how we keep the moral dimension without resorting to spectacle." Every step they prepared was documented in ways that would later resequence truth into evidence. Grant had a peculiar comfort in paperwork. It made decisions visible, consequences traceable. The house of his life had always been built on records, ledgers, minutes, contracts, and, he realized now, the defaults of trust. If a trust could be misplaced, there would be words to make it right again. And then the moment settled into a vicious elegance. Sienna filed. The service was quiet when it arrived. It landed not with a bang, but with a measured knock at the end of a week of peculiar calm. A courier left a sealed envelope at the front desk. Sienna opened it with an amused flourish in the late afternoon sun. Her face, as she read, was unreadable for a stretch, then colored into something close to triumph. She told Grant in the next room, casual about the morning's events, as if reporting on the weather. "This is what I want," she said, waving the paper in that effortless way people who believe they have secured an outcome do. "It's fair, given everything. 70%. I can live very well." Grant placed his hands on the sink and breathed. He let the breath steady his nerves. He had anticipated a filing, yes, and had indeed orchestrated their readiness. Still, the sensation of the paper in her hand, the officialness of it, made something in him tremble. That tremor was not fear of loss. It was the knowledge that a contest had now become formalized, and that the stakes were now both legal and public. They moved then according to the choreography they'd prepared. Franklin filed the necessary responses. Cole read the petition and shook his head at the looseness of the claims. Not because they were weak per se, but because arrogance had made them stray into the kind of specificity that could be contradicted. The more specific the allegations, the more they invited precise rebuttal. Grant's role resumed its practiced cadence. Composed in public, thorough in private. He would let her make her argument in court. He would not preempt the moment with theatrics or accusations in the press. There is a dignity to measured waiting, he thought, not moral superiority, but tactical advantage. In the quiet hours before the court date, he replayed the stairwell recording again. He listened to the inflection in her voice, the laugh at the mention of numbers, the precise way she described the timeline she imagined. Words lost their power when understood as instruments. The file became less a provocation and more a schematic, an explanation of motive that Franklin would later render in language a judge could accept and a jury could follow. He sat alone with the documents and the memory of small, intimate things. Mornings when the house smelled of coffee and the ordinary future felt real. He realized that what he was losing was not only a legal stake, but the daily expectation of companionship. Law could remedy transfers and silence accounts. It could not restore the trust that had been spent in private economies of attention. Yet he could make sure the ledger reflected the truth. That, he decided, would have to be enough. As the court date approached, small convergences of people materialized in his life. Franklin finalizing motions at his side, Cole double-checking evidence chains, a city prosecutor beginning to ask polite questions that suggested interest beyond divorce, interest in possible fraud and conspiracy. When Detective Rhodes appeared in the periphery of a meeting, uniform by day, a glint of institutional authority, Grant felt the machinery of justice aligning with the documents they'd amassed. There would be arrests if the evidence compelled them. There would be consequences. But until the judge pronounced, everything remained a promise, a ledger balanced delicately on testimony. On the eve of the hearing, Grant walked the estate alone. The sky over the property was of velvet, far enough from the city that stars looked like small, deliberate punctures of light. In the distance, the fountain near the main entrance kept its steady voice, a mechanical heartbeat. He thought of the first time they had stood at that fountain, young and incautious, making vows that now dissolved into litigation. He felt the double loss, the disappearance of a marriage, and the erosion of an easy, unexamined life. He also felt a cold satisfaction that can only come from the alignment of plan and execution. For years he had measured moves in increments, in the accumulation of advantage. He had been 10 steps ahead in many affairs. That was his talent. But this time he had planned far more than 10 steps. The staircase of his patience included back doors he would not take for pleasure, but for justice. He sat on the terrace and let the night come. The house hummed with the quiet confidence of value.
His staff moved through the night performing tasks that would make the house presentable for a spectacle it had not chosen. There was a moral arithmetic to what he felt. Winning would not erase the betrayal, but losing would allow its pattern to repeat elsewhere. The law, imperfect as it is, was at least a language in which he could argue for correction. Before sleep, he replayed the stairwell recording one last time. Sienna's laughter was lighter now, encapsulated in a microphone and unguarded. She spoke of futures brightened by the absence of restraint, of plans that turned people into numbers. That unguarded voice, the one that had believed itself safe from consequence, was now the central exhibit in a case that would decide more than property. It would decide whether a pattern of predation, dressed in charm and wrapped in philanthropic faces, could be converted into an open ledger of culpability. He turned the file off, placed the device in the envelope he had used to store it, and then placed the envelope inside a locked safe whose combination was known to only a few. The action had the ritual of sealing an oath. It was not vindictive, it was a measure of responsibility he accepted, for himself and for others who might one day need the precedent. As dawn came and the case moved toward public forum, the tension settled into its final taut rank. All the pieces would be where they needed to be. He imagined the courtroom, the varnished wood, the rings of light where the sun would strike the floor, the judge's bench rising like a small island of neutrality. He imagined Sienna's entry, confident and bright, still holding to the belief she had created an unassailable argument. And he imagined, with a certainty that felt like a relief, the moment her voice on the stairwell would be played in a room that required truth be expressed through records and testimony, not whispers and boasts. He had learned, over the years, that public spectacles reward the prepared and punish the overconfident. Sienna had shown her hand early, in a room that believed her script. He had folded his hand so that when the table met the light of law, the cards would fall the right way. He rose from the terrace as the first light of the day painted the hedges of faint gold, and walked inside. He moved through the house with a quiet that was not emptiness but deliberation. Tonight, the world would see a courtroom. Tomorrow, it would learn whether performance could be sustained against the weight of documented pattern. Grant Whitmore, who had become known for moving several plays ahead, felt the cool calm of a man who had built a scaffold of evidence and patience. He closed the study door behind him, and, for a brief moment before they all met in a public theater of law, allowed himself the private thought that had come often in the last weeks. She thought she was 10 steps ahead, but he had been moving well beyond the length of her imagination. He arrived at the courthouse before most of the cameras had found their stations, stepping from the back of a sleek sedan into air that smelt faintly of rain and exhaust. The building's granite face took on the early light with a cold, impartial gleam. Inside, the marble echoed with the shuffle of shoes, the metallic clack of briefcases. Security screens blinked in an indifferent rhythm. Grant moved through it all like a man accustomed to moving through institutions, careful, unhurried, invisible when it suited him. Sienna entered later, arriving with an entourage that might have been designed to reassure a nervous client or to perform certainty. Her dress was exact for the photographs. Her smile was an investment in optics. Jackson Reed waited at her elbow, a presence more practiced than candid. His suit fitted, his expression reheated from charm. Reporters rustled for focus as they passed. Cameras clicked. A low buzz of public expectation wrapped the pair like a net. Grant watched them from across the gallery, not with malice, but with the detached assessment of someone reading a scene he had anticipated. Around him, people took their seats, acquainted faces from philanthropy, lawyers whose reputations preferred temperate columns in legal journals, a handful of strangers who had come only because spectacle tastes like gossip. Franklin Doyle sat beside Grant, dossier in hand, his gestures economical. Cole Maddox took a seat at the back, eyes moving like a man tracking patterns in clouds. Judge Hamilton entered with the slow dignity of a person whose authority had not been earned on television. The courtroom hushed. Phones were silenced. A clerk announced the case. his voice a procedural bell that transformed chatter into attention. Franklin began with an opening that smelled of paper and restraint. He did not shout, he did not lean on oratory. He set the scene, not with fury, but with the clarity of someone who understands that the law rewards precision. He outlined the premarital protections that formed the spine of Grant's wealth, the corporate structures that separated personal holdings from marital income, and the actions that, when taken together, suggested a program of extraction rather than a mere dispute. He asked the court not for theatrical vindication, but for recognition of a pattern. Sienna's counsel answered in the softer register of a practiced counter. Speak to fairness, to rights under equitable distribution, to a wife who had been entitled to expectations formed in the intimacy of marriage. The petition, read aloud, was an exercise in calm entitlement. 70%. The number lingered like a provocation. Then Franklin called for the first exhibit, and the courtroom changed its shape from formal chamber to arena of evidence. He presented the LLC filings, the prenuptial document, the chain of ownership forms that explained, in sentences of legal weight, how certain assets had been defined long before the marriage. The words were plain but effective: separate property, irrevocable grant, non-participation clause. He did not sensationalize the language. He let it do its work by being exact. Excerpt, prenuptial agreement, selected paragraphs. Article 4. Parties acknowledge the existence of premarital entities listed in Schedule A. Such entities and their assets shall remain separate property. Article 6. The parties waive any claim to alter the governance of identified entities absent manifest fraud or material misrepresentation at the time of execution. Schedule A. Whitmore Holdings, LLC, Whitmore Real Estate Trust, Whitmore Ventures, LP. Franklin's voice remained steady as he walked the court through dates and signatures.
The documents read like a map, boundaries drawn in ink and notarized witness. The effect was immediate for anyone who listened without the desire to crown a victor before evidence. The architecture of ownership did not guarantee immunity from challenge, but it did compress the arena into technical terms that courts respect. Then came the financial patterns. Cole's charts were introduced. Travel logs, intermediary accounts, a constellation of payments that, while composed of discrete legal transactions, suggested a choreography. Franklin did not pretend the accounts were criminal on their own. He argued instead that when private contracts and payments were made in the context of unduly personal benefit, and when a voice, recorded, admitted intent to appropriate, the court could consider the whole as evidence of a scheme. The question would not be whether each transaction was legal individually, but whether the pattern, combined with representations made within the marriage, altered the equitable calculus. Intent can be a difficult thing to prove, Franklin said quietly. That is why we do not rely on conjecture. We rely on the words that were spoken and the paths that the money traveled. When he asked for the stairwell recording to be played, the room tightened as if preparing to breathe in. A clerk pressed play, a speaker blinked, a voice filled the space. Intimate, unguarded, the life of a private conversation transferred into the public gravity of a courtroom. Sienna's laugh sounded small without the echo of stair carpeting. The words were simple in structure and devastating in effect. An accountant's vocabulary, a planning voice that spoke as if the room belonged to her. Excerpt, playback transcript, court exhibit. Sienna, recorded. We close next quarter. He won't even notice until it's all done. By then, there's nothing to contest. Lawsuits are slow, and I will be gone. Jackson, recorded. You have him trained. He'll never suspect in a million years. Sienna, recorded, laughing. I told you, numbers are just numbers. Men like him trade feelings for ledgers. We'll just move the ledgers. The playback did not need dramatization. It was a private admission now translated into evidence. The laugh, the arithmetic of language, the casual dismissal of a husband's attentions, it all landed with the strange clarity a recording brings.
People lean differently when the world's filters fall away and a recording is all that remains. Sienna's face altered incrementally, first a tightening around the mouth, then eyes that searched for an exit that a court could not provide. Jackson's composure, which had the sheen of rehearsed charm, showed small cracks. His jaw worked under the skin. Grant watched all this with a face that gave nothing away. His breath moved at a normal pace. He measured the room's responses as if reading an index. The playback was only the hinge. Franklin called witnesses, staff who had noticed the late-night bookings, a finance manager who could speak to the movement of funds into intermediary accounts. Each witness added a small, non-sensational fact to the ledger that, when assembled, suggested method. Cole's interviews were read into the record in redacted form. Hotel receipts, booking confirmations, consultancy agreements with vague scopes. These items read like a pattern rather than a singular infraction. Throughout the hearing, Sienna's counsel attempted to reframe the narrative. Friendship misread as conspiracy, generosity misread as extortion. The gallery murmured, the press scribbled. But the motion to freeze certain accounts, filed ahead by Franklin and supported with Cole's chain of custody, took the argument out of mere accusation and into the realm of immediate remedy. Judge Hamilton considered the request with the judicial patience of someone weighing not only law but consequence. Given the prima facie nature of the affidavits presented and the risk of dissipation, the judge said, voice even, the court will issue a temporary restraining order to preserve the status quo of assets listed in Schedule B pending further hearing. The restraining order was a procedural incantation that felt to some like victory and to others like a preliminary precaution. For Grant, it was neither triumph nor solace. It was a practical cordon that prevented swift evisceration. It allowed the case to be argued in the space the law provided, not on the retractable stage of rumor. But the hearing did not end at civil division. Franklin had coordinated with authorities who had been watching the financial patterns related to several similar complaints. Earlier inquiries, anonymous and tentative, had converged once Cole's evidence provided a common thread. Prosecutors had arrived at the courthouse with warrants drafted in quiet offices. Detective Rhodes, who had been in the periphery since preliminary inquiries suggested criminal exposure, stood now at counsel table when the court took a brief recess. When proceedings reconvened, the mood had shifted. The judge allowed prosecutors to present new information that fell within his purview to consider. Evidence that money had been moved under misrepresentations and that certain transfers bore the hallmarks of conspiracy to defraud. The tone of the prosecutor's presentation was not hostile rhetoric. It was a filing of consequence backed by chain of custody affidavits and bank reports already under subpoena. Detective Rhodes rose when called. His testimony was compact. The existence of accounts funneling funds to intermediary entities, the overlapping beneficial owner information that Cole had flagged, and the corroborating witness statements. He was careful with phrases, probable cause, reasonable belief, words that weigh heavier than drama. The courtroom held its breath as the clerk read the arrest warrant. Sienna's expression collapsed inwards, like paper burned at the edges. Her bravado, so structural in social rooms, unraveled under the clinical pronouncement of legal consequence. On the charge of conspiracy to commit wire fraud and related counts, the clerk read, the court finds probable cause under the evidence submitted and authorizes temporary custodia. Grant felt no exultation. He felt the mechanical certainty of law executing an outcome the documents had predicted. The handcuffs were not an act of vengeance meted out by a husband. They were the state following its own rules, guided by the ledger of evidence that had been assembled. Detective Rhodes moved with professional efficiency. Jackson Reed was led out cuffed, 2 doors down, eyes wide with the realization that charm does not translate into immunity. Sienna's collapse was less theatrical than tragic. Small sounds at the back of the courtroom that could be mistaken for breath. She pleaded, at least in those initial seconds, not for the court, but for time to gather, for counsel to consult. The scene was human and therefore unavoidable. Cameras attempted to capture more than they should.
Some captured the moment a woman who had planned her freedom suddenly misread the reach of institutions built for accountability. Judge Hamilton made short, careful orders. Certain accounts frozen, limited access to the estate granted under supervision, law enforcement authorized to execute arrests. The judge deferred the ultimate questions about equitable distribution to subsequent hearings, allowing the criminal process to proceed on its own timeline. The courtroom remained a mixture of procedural temerity and human unraveling. Later, as press statements were made and detentions formalized, Grant slipped away from the fray with Franklin and Cole. They did not celebrate. The victory, if it could be called that, was an alignment of process and truth, nothing more. He understood, sharply, that the public account of the event would be shortened into headlines and verdicts. He also knew that his integrity felt diminished in ways no legal order could restore. Winning did not stitch the emptiness of trust back together. Excerpt: Arrest Affidavit Summary. Allegations: conspiracy to commit wire and bank fraud, material misrepresentation for the purpose of inducing transfers. Evidence: recorded admissions, see Exhibit A, financial transfer schematics, Exhibit B, witness statements, Exhibit C. Probable cause affirmed by Detective Rhodes, warrants authorized by prosecutor's office. Grant watched Sienna as she was led away in a subdued, unvarnished procession. The crowd outside the courthouse swelled with those hungry for an image of moral clarity. She looked at him once, a glance thick with a calculus that had misjudged his capacity for patience. When their eyes met, nothing theatrical passed between them. No shout, no recrimination, no apology worthy of reconstruction. Only silence that filled with the weight of law. Days later, the press cycle found a rhythm. Headlines simplified complexity into dichotomies. Predator and prey, betrayed billionaire, wife arrested. Columnists argued about motives. Pundits drew moral conclusions. Social feeds churned commentary for attention. Grant read very little. He let Franklin handle the inquiries, and he allowed Cole to liaise with investigators, pursuing other names that Cole's pattern recognition suggested might be implicated. The legal machine, once set in motion, had its own appetite. Sienna's public unraveling continued in quieter rooms. Interviews behind glass, detention hearings where counsel argued for bail, and private moments captured by surveillance that the prosecution would later present. Jackson's arrest resulted in a confession that was not total, but contained admissions of facilitating certain transactions. His cooperation, in turn, unfurled lines of inquiry that implicated intermediary advisors who had benefited from opaque routing. Each link in the chain was not dramatic in itself, but together they formed a rationale substantive enough for prosecutors to pursue charges beyond a simple divorce dispute. For Grant, the aftermath was a study in muted consequences. The estate required management that avoided spectacle but retained transparency. He engaged with trustees and counsel to ensure the business continuity that allowed employees and partners to trust in the stability of operations. He sat in meetings where numbers were parsed and reputations were tended to like fragile porcelain. He slept in a house that had become both cell of memory and repository of evidence. He also began, with a slow deliberation, to reckon with what had been lost. The daily absence of someone who had shared a life is not a ledger entry. It is not something to code into a spreadsheet. It is raw, an unpredictably aching thing. He missed small, ordinary noises. The empty chair across a dinner table swallowed the shape of conversation into silence. He allowed himself grief in private, an admission that legal order did not replace domestic loss. Cole continued his work, following small threads that promised to prevent similar schemes. He worked through nights compiling evidence, reaching out to counsel of those who had been suggested as possible victims. Some agreed to proceed, others preferred silence. The pattern, Cole said, was not a new story but a repeated one. Access given freely, then exploited. Cole's notes thickened into exhibits that prosecutors welcomed. His voice no longer belonged only to the case of one marriage. It began to sound like the beginning of a public ledger that could deter predation. Excerpt: Cole Maddox Field Digest. Follow-up contacts. 7 potential witnesses agreed to provide statements. 3 declined. Intermediary advisors. 2 firms flagged for inconsistent disclosures. Further subpoenas recommended.
Recommendation: coordinated civil-criminal approach to secure evidence and hold intermediary parties to account. Sienna's hearings unfolded in a series of rooms far from cameras. Her breakdowns became private, her bravado exhausted in legal argumentation that demanded technical clarity in place of performance. She refused sometimes, in interviews with her lawyers, to own the moral scale of what had happened. Other times, when confronted with a ledger of payments and witnesses, she faltered. Public opinion turned in small tides. Some sympathized with a woman who had once occupied public platforms of philanthropy. Others saw the accumulation of evidence as confirmation of a deliberate career of advantage-taking. Grant's public statement, delivered through Franklin after the initial hearings, was brief and measured. He thanked the institutions that had acted, he acknowledged the human cost involved, and he refused to sensationalize the private in order to make a point. He emphasized prevention, suggesting that his interest in the matter had not been revenge but a desire to limit harm, to himself and potentially to others who might be targeted. "There is no joy in this outcome," his statement read. "We pursued a legal resolution because facts were misrepresented and because injustice was being wrought at the expense of trust and private security. Our concern has been steadiness of process and accountability." In private, he walked the estate often on the perimeters of his life. The fountain still played its regular note. Gardeners pruned with the same clinical care as always. The house hummed with the continuity of staff who had been collateral in all this, people whose livelihoods depended on the steadiness of management rather than private drama. They offered, in small acts of competence, a thread of normalcy Grant found himself grateful for. Months passed in the slow mechanics of litigation. Sienna faced criminal charges that could carry serious consequences. Civil hearings parsed the distribution of assets and the question of restitution. The judge, when finally addressing the equitable division, took into account the premarital structures and the recent findings of conspiracy. The court did not rush to absolutes. It balanced recognition of separate property with the need to address ill-gotten transfers. The outcome was neither total exoneration nor dramatic retribution. It was a legal partitioning that reflected the forces that had brought them into court. Excerpt: Judicial order selected. The court acknowledges the validity of premarital entities as articulated in Schedule A, and recognizes the need to protect separate property. Transfers identified as the subject of ongoing criminal investigation are excluded from marital division pending resolution of criminal proceedings. Counsel for both parties to meet with the court-appointed forensic accountant for clarification of transfers recorded between 2018-2021. When the immediate legal dust settled enough for Grant to stand in front of the estate's fountain once more, he did not feel vindicated in a way that made him lighter. The victory had not been a reclamation of a life, but a closing of a chapter he had never wanted to open. He understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with triumph, that justice had its own metric, not satisfaction, but correction. Sienna's final moments in court, before she entered a plea arrangement on criminal counts, and while civil matters wound toward settlement, were a study in the collapse of a life resplendent in public, but barren in the particulars that matter most. She looked older than her years. Jackson's name became a footnote in deposition transcripts and a cautionary example offered by those who now spoke more openly about manipulation and financial predation. In quieter hours, alone in his office where paper and photographs still held the weight of memory, Grant allowed himself a private calculus. He did not do so to tally points. He did it because the mind organizes pain into lessons that either harden the soul or soften it. He wanted neither unnecessary hardening nor naive forgetting. He wanted balance.
She thought she was 10 steps ahead, he said once to Franklin, not as a taunt but as an observation of misjudgment. The lawyer nodded, understanding the arithmetic of strategy. You went further, Franklin replied, voice dry but not unkind. You gave her a stage and let her perform. That performance, when brought into the light, folds easily. There is a cost to such patient work. Grant felt it in the nights when the house was too quiet. He felt it in the way old laughter could no longer be assumed safe. He felt, too, the small, steady relief of a world where patterns could be interrupted not by private retribution, but by the institutions designed to regulate such harms. The law had not restored intimacy, but it had prevented the worst of the designs Sienna had sketched aloud on a landing one unguarded morning. On an afternoon not long after the court's temporary orders, Grant left the estate to travel quietly. He did not make a show of departure. He packed a carry-on, a single book, and a photograph he took from the mantel that had once recorded smiles. He walked through the gate with the same steady gait with which he had returned months earlier. The sky was a clean blue that seemed, for the moment, indifferent to human affairs. As he pulled away from the drive, he thought of the many small games of strategy he had played in life, negotiations and acquisitions, quiet retreats and public stances. He had been practiced in anticipating moves, in measuring risk, in converting offense to defense without spectacle. This was one more instance of that temperament, though costlier than most. He thought of the stairwell voice again, and how it had sounded when translated into an exhibit. Casual, assured, and oddly naive. She had believed she was outside the reach of consequence because she had assumed law moved slowly and sentiment would disguise pattern. She misunderstood the force of methodical patience. He had not reacted with rage, he had responded with process. He had not sought to humiliate her, he had sought to ensure her actions would not be a blueprint for future harm. At the airport, as the plane readied to depart, he pocketed the photograph and closed his eyes for a moment. The hum of engines and the distant chatter of passengers were small and ordinary. He imagined a future not defined by this rupture, but shaped by it. Quieter, more guarded, perhaps more honest in the way it had to be. There was loss, yes, a kind that no legal remedy could touch. There was, too, the strange, patient comfort of one who had prepared beyond what an opponent had imagined. When he returned home weeks later, he walked once more to the fountain. The water glinted like a ledger closed for the night. He stood there and let the air fill his lungs. For a long time he said nothing. The world did not offer him applause. It offered him the practicalities of consequence and the knowledge that a pattern of exploitation had been interrupted not by spectacle but by proof and process. She had thought she was unaware, had believed herself already across the threshold of freedom. In truth, he had been many steps ahead, not in vindictiveness but in forethought. He had planned not to surprise her with noise, but to let the architecture of law and evidence do what it does best: reveal, restrain, correct. He had been beyond her projection of 10 steps. In the private ledger of his mind, he tallied a quieter figure. He walked away from the fountain and into his house, closing the door behind him with a soft, decisive click. It was not a gesture of triumph. It was an ending performed with dignity, a man choosing to move forward. If this story found you gripped by the idea of measured justice or the cost of betrayal, share your thoughts below. For more stories that probe the space between appearance and truth, like and subscribe, and we'll bring you another chapter of lives where the law and human frailty meet.